Good morning, everybody. Welcome to week 3 of our FDN2400 online course. I hope you all had a nice Labor Day weekend and an even better start to the short week that we have here. Short weeks are kind of strange, but it's Wednesday, and you all should have seen this presentation in. I posted it, just the actual slides in our week 3. So this is the video to go with the slides, and again, it's based on our readings for week 3. I did find a typo in our working online class schedule. And you all know that the Whistling Vivaldi chapter show that chapter 4 is read every week. That's not the case. We are on chapter 3 this week with the continuation of the suspense related to the stereotype threat that they were looking at in chapter 2. So chapter 3 is where we get to see how those experiments surfaced the actual stereotype for those students that they were looking at. So let's get started and let's look at our learning objectives. So by the end of this week, you all are going to be able to think about and understand key legal cases and decisions related to select social justice concepts. We're going to be discussing and reviewing oppression, power, and privilege this week, and how it manifests both in our personal and our professional lives. And I want you all to think about some of the concepts in here in terms of your research paper, because there's some key positions that may be relevant as you start to critically analyze the programs that you've chosen within the equity literacy framework. So this third bullet discussed and reviewed the implications on our teaching and learning practice via systems of internalized dominance and oppression. These two concepts are going to be issues that you all might use as you frame your arguments for or against the validity of the programs that you choose. And we're also going to look at the 5 faces of oppression, which also will give you a foundational stance with which to partner with the equity literacy framework as you look and analyze your research project programs. And then finally, we're just going to take a look at some big picture trends in education, accountability, and reform in our country right now, and what some of the implications of those trends are in terms of practice and how schools function. So I hope this was clear. And we're going to start with the legal foundations. We're going to look at the U.S. Constitution here in these next couple slides, and then I'm going to segue into some Supreme Court cases and just some general case law about issues related to separation of church and state, the establishment of religion in schools, free speech, equal opportunity, those types of concepts, just so you can get a fairly solid framework on why schools do the things that they do. This is not an often spoken about topic from what I've experienced, and I think having some foundation in the legal frameworks around policies and practice can help you determine your professional priorities, basically, and how you work towards becoming a more equity literate instructor, teacher in the classroom, and helping to redefine how equity looks, inclusion looks, and social justice looks in the schools that you all are going to serve. So let's look at the first constitutional amendment. I don't know, you all should have an idea that public schooling is not called for in our United States Constitution. There is no federally written mandate that the country, the government, is to be responsible for education. The 10th Amendment is the states' rights amendment. So it says the power is not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, or reserved to the states, respectively, or to the people. So when you're hearing folks talk about states' rights issues, they're most likely referencing the 10th Amendment of the Constitution. So whatever the federal government has no oversight over, it is given to the states as part of what the Founding Fathers spoke and believed in when this country was founded. So by that, public schools fall under this category, and all 50 states have constitutions that outline how public and non-public schools are administered in each state, and they're all different. And I would highly recommend pulling North Carolina's constitution so you can kind of see what the guidelines, policies, and procedures are. I might put a link in our week 3 just so you can quickly access it, and I'll make it a URL in our As You Learn page. So again, 10th Amendment dictates that the states are in charge of public and non-public schooling in the states. So the First Amendment, I think you all are fairly clear that this deals with freedom of speech, but the two clauses that are equally pertinent related to the First Amendment is the Establishment Clause, which is related to the separation of church and state, and of course the Free Speech Clause and the right to assemble and petition the government. So full First Amendment text says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. That's the Establishment Clause. Or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances. That last section is the Free Speech Clause and the right to protest for all citizens in this country. We hear a lot in popular culture, on cable news, entertainment networks, that the First Amendment is abbreviated in a lot of the conversations where it talks about free speech. There's a lot of discussion going on across campuses in the United States about student free speech and who gets to speak on campuses. But I just wanted to frame this for you all so you can see that the First Amendment covers a wide swath of how things should be done in this country in terms of the establishment of religion by the government, as well as the right to free speech and protest of the citizens of this country. So this is the First Amendment and the two clauses. We're going to be looking at some cases, like I said earlier, in relation to these three amendments. The Third Amendment related to public schooling is the 14th Amendment. This is the Equal Protection Clause, and this clause has been used in case law to establish the right of a free and public education for students from minoritized social groups. So the 14th Amendment states that no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. So this is termed, the 14th Amendment is termed the equal protection. It covers a wide range of public school policies, from access to education, how discipline is run in the schools, and how students are to be treated constitutionally within the bounds of public school policy. So this is a pretty big one. And you'll see a lot of familiar case history around this, and you'll probably see some unfamiliar case law around this. So let's look at the first set of cases. These are constitutional issues related to the First Amendment, the Establishment Clause regarding the establishment of religion in public education, and we have here 4 fairly often cited cases, Supreme Court cases, that I just want to review quickly here. You all can stick these in your Google search engine and actually read the full cases. I'm a little goofy that I like going to the Supreme Court website and reading the decisions that come down. Here recently, in the last maybe 10 years, the Supreme Court has ruled on a number of education cases related to equity, inclusion, and socially just practices from K to university policies. So if you go to the SCOTUS website, you will find a wide range of interesting cases, and you can see why how the justices come down on these issues in their own words, and not relying on, like I said earlier, entertainment news on cable networks, and all of those news cycles and 24-hour news stations are entertainment news sites. So the Grand Rapids School District versus Ball is a 1985 case, and the Aguilar versus Felton is a 1985 case. Zobrist versus Catalina Foothills School District is the early 90s, 1993. The Board of Education of Kiriash Joel Village School District versus Grumet is 1994, and then Agostini versus Felton is 1997. These 4 cases all cover issues related to public funds, which are tax money, and using those monies in religious education. They cover religious practices in the public school setting, and I did that twice, so let me take this off. Just going to delete this. Sorry about that. So, and there's one other case that I'm going to talk to you about. It's Lemon versus Kurtman after this. So let's look at the Grand Rapids and the Aguilar 1985 cases. The issues at hand for both of these cases was instruction related to students who are attending non-public schools and receiving supplementary education by public school teachers. So essentially, public school teachers were going into religious schools, into private schools, and providing instruction to students who were basically in religious schools. Okay, the Supreme Court ruled that the action of teachers going into public school teachers going into religious institutions of education violated the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment, and that it ultimately promoted religion. You would have to read the case in depth. It's a long Supreme Court text that this decision is based on, but it was found, and it has not been overturned, that public school teachers going into religious schools and providing instruction, it does violate the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. The Zobrist case of 1993 looked at a provision of a school district interpreter for a deaf student who was attending a Catholic high school. So in this case, the Supreme Court ruled that any government program that neutrally provides benefits to a broad class of citizens, in this case deaf students, okay, students with disabilities, without reference to religion, they're not immediately in violation of the First Amendment Establishment Clause. So this case is neutral in that the student was only getting interpretation of instruction. The public school representative was not directly instructing that student within the Catholic school, as in the Grand Rapids and Aguilar cases. Okay, those teachers were actually going in and providing religious instruction. So that's the difference. Interpretation, providing understanding of what's going on in a situation for a deaf student is a neutral activity. It's similar to what you see when in current press conferences there is a deaf interpreter providing sign language interpretation for whoever's speaking on the press conference. So that's neutrality. It does not violate the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. So the next one, the Board of Education of Curious Joel Village, is related to a Jewish community establishing a school district in New York. But it was a public school district only for Hasidic Jews in the state. And the Supreme Court ruled on this case that this establishment of a school district violated the First Amendment Establishment Clause because it was a form of religious favoritism, which is in quotes, that even though it is a public school, by it being solely for the students and children of this particular Jewish community, it was an establishment of an education institution that intended to use public funds by excluding other communities from attending this public school. Okay, it was only for Hasidic Jewish families. And then the Agostini 1997 case is a Title I provision for disadvantaged schools. It's about Title I teachers going from the public school into religious schools, serving those students that are at risk. Okay. In this case, there was a lower court decision that banned district teachers from going into religious schools. The Supreme Court overturned the ban, provided that the district, the school district that's assigning the public school teachers, they needed to be assigned without regard to their religious affiliation, without regard to religious symbolism. All of that had to be removed from the classrooms. The teachers must have had and continue to have limited contact with religious personnel in the actual religious schoolhouse, and that public school supervisors had to make monthly unannounced inspections. They did not stop the public school teachers from serving students, underserved students in the public schools. In the religious institution. They just made it clear that there had to be a strict line between, again, separation of church and state. Okay, and then finally, Lemon versus Kirkman is a 1971 case that created what was called the Lemon test, and it is a test that's used to determine if federal monies, public school monies, are actually being used inappropriately in religious institutions. And it came up with, the Supreme Court came up with this Lemon test of 3 questions to determine whether or not public funds are in fact crossing the line between the separation of church and state. Those three questions that came about to determine whether this line was crossed is: one, does the act of using the money have a secular purpose? So is it used to advance public school principles, or is it used to advance religious education principles? The second question is, does the primary effect of using the money advance or inhibit religion? So is it not establishing religion, or is it establishing religion? And then the final question is, does the act of using this money excessively entangle government and religion? So does the money put an undue burden on the government in the establishment, the sustenance of religious principles and policies in public schools? Okay, so this is kind of a litmus test. This lemon test is a litmus test for the Supreme Court when they get cases related to public monies and their use in the public school and in private religious schools, in determining whether or not the line between church and state has been crossed. I highly recommend particularly these cases because they are pretty interesting. I've read all of them, including Lemon versus Kurtzman. It's a 1971 case. You all can Google all of those. Let me add that on here for you. And you can see how these issues have been adjudicated at the Supreme Court level. So that's just a brief overview. So let's look at Equal Protection Clause, segregation and desegregation, and some of the cases and information related to separate but equal opportunity. The Civil Rights Act of 1964. A little bit about multicultural education. We're going to talk about, well, I've provided you some resources inside of the Moodle page related to multicultural education if you're interested in that. We're not going to get too much in detail about that here, but I just wanted to make it available to you in our articles for the week. We're going to talk about Section 504, Education for All Handicapped Children, and the IDEA Act, and then a little bit about FERPA. You just need to know that that is the regulation that protects student and family information in the school from outside sources. It's a confidentiality agreement. So the first case goes back to the 19th century. It's Plessy versus Ferguson of 1896, and this was about one of the first cases related to separate but equal opportunity, and is it actually constitutional to have, for instance, black versus white facilities? Okay, in this case it was a railway company that was being sued to provide equal accommodations for black Americans and white Americans, and should they provide similar resources on this particular railway company. It went all the way to the Supreme Court. The court did decide that the 14th Amendment implied political only, not social equality. So they ruled that separate but equal was okay in this instance because it was a social group scenario, not a political scenario. So in this case, the railway company was allowed to implement white only and black only accommodations on this particular train. So this was the first major landmark case that instituted legal separation of social groups based on groupings. And in this case, it was blacks versus whites. Okay. In 1954, I'm sure you all have heard, have read about, have discussed at some point in your school careers the Brown versus Board of Education case of 1954. This was the rethinking of the Plessy versus Ferguson case, and it was brought again to the Supreme Court on the legality of separate but equal. And in the 1954 case, it was argued that the separate but equal doctrine has no place in education, and that dual school systems are inherently unequal. Okay, and this we're going to get into a little bit more when we talk about discriminatory practices. By the nature of segregation, the minoritized social group will never get equal status with the dominant social group. It's just how this society has been cultured throughout its establishment and history. Okay, so Brown versus Board of Education struck down the Plessy versus Ferguson decision that separate is not equal, and that's why we celebrate this at certain times during the year and when this is brought up. So the third case is Griffin versus County School Board of Prince Edward County in 1964, and this is an interesting case in that it was about whether or not this county could close its schools wholeheartedly, just close all of its schools and provide assistance to the private schools for white students. Okay, so basically this school district was closing the public school district so its teachers could go in and support the private schools for white students. Supreme Court said that the local district court decision had to be overturned, and the Supreme Court required that the school districts reopen and operate a non-discriminatory public school system. So the taxes that were being used in the public school system to pay those teachers, they could not go to the private school during public school time and provide services to those private school students in the white private schools, because it was a misuse of public school funds, of public funds and taxes. So they had to reopen those public schools and cease and desist going into those private schools. Okay, and the Lau versus Nichols is our one case related to the provision of English for non-native speakers. This is from 1974, and it was a lawsuit filed on behalf of Chinese-speaking students in California. At this time, there was about 35,000 Chinese students in the San Francisco school district, and only about 1,700 of them were receiving English language and special English language instruction. Okay, the Supreme Court ruled that this was a violation of the 1994 Civil Rights Act. The 1964 Civil Rights Act. And they stated essentially that basic English skills are necessary and are a fundamental principle of what the public school is intended to do, to provide a free, equal, and substantive education for all students in attendance. And that means if we have students that are coming from different native languages, that English language needs to be taught in the school in some form or fashion so they can access that public education appropriately. Okay, so again, all of these case laws are, you can just type them in Google and access them and see the full text of them. I just wanted to give you a sampling. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 had two specific titles. Title 6 states that no person in the United States shall, on the ground of race, color, or national origin, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefit of, or be subjected to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. Public schools still receive federal funds even though they are operating under state constitutional regulations, but any public school receiving federal funds in terms of grants, which are numerous, cannot discriminate based on race, color, or national origin. Okay. Title 7 of the same Civil Rights Act states it's an employer-based discriminatory clause, and it says, because of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin, cannot discriminate against any individual related to how they're paid, how they're hired, the conditions of employment, and the privileges of their employment. Okay, so this is the Equal Employment Opportunities Act, is based in this civil rights title of the 1964 Act. And then the Title IX educational amendment is dealing with discrimination on the basis of sex and gender. No person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to the discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal funds. So these were implemented in the, I guess, mid to late 20th century to rectify the discriminatory practices that had been coming along in this country through Jim Crow, the discrimination against women from the early 20th century in terms of voting and the rights of women. These amendments and acts supported the abolishment of discriminatory behaviors for institutions who are receiving public funds. So the last two, Section 504 and Public Law 94-142, which is now what we all know as the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, deal with accessing a free and public education for students with disabilities. And the big thing I want you all to take from this is that students with disabilities need to receive equal treatment as in the other civil rights context of the Civil Rights Act and Education Amendments Act. Okay, what equal means does not mean the same. It means that the implementation of programs, policies, and procedures must fit the students' circumstances within the school. So it's very individualized opportunities, programs, and policies to ensure that students with disabilities receive the same treatment in accessing their public education. Okay, so that's both of those. Section 504 deals a little bit more in detail with disability beyond what we think of disability, and they talk about handicapped persons, and it includes physical and mental impairment, which limits major life activities. Okay, so I want y'all to just go in and review these laws. You can type these in and go to the Department of Education website and see these. We're not going to get into a whole lot of detail, but just know that these are about eliminating discrimination for various social groups from race, ethnicity, national origin, ability, etc. Okay? And they're all Equal Protection Clause interpretations. So students' rights is the last set of case law that we'll talk about. We talked a little bit about having a right to a free and public education. We read in the 14th Amendment about the right to due process, the First Amendment, the right to free speech, the Equal Protection Clause, all of these, and then sexual harassment, etc. All of these fall under the 4th and 14th Amendment of the Constitution. So Plyler versus Doe, 1982, was the rights to education for illegal immigrants. And the court struck down a Texas law that denied a free public education to children of illegal immigrants. So our Constitution has been interpreted to state that children of illegal immigrants cannot be denied a free and public education. Okay, that's the Plyler versus Doe decision. Goss versus Lopez is about due process and the implementation of school disciplinary codes and procedures. It was about a student who was being suspended from high school, and he did not, or she did not have a hearing. The Supreme Court ruled that only in an emergency can a student be suspended without a hearing. So when you all start getting into building your education philosophies and your disciplinary codes of conduct in your classroom, you need to be thinking about a continuum of interventions for your students before removing your students from your educational environment in your classroom. Okay? All students have to have some sort of due process before they are removed from the educational environment. And that goes from the classroom level up through to the main office. And Goss versus Lopez articulates how this occurs. So the Tinker versus Des Moines Independent Community School District is dealing with free speech rights of students. This was during the time of the Vietnam War, and the students in this particular high school were protesting the United States involvement in the Vietnam War. Okay, they came to school with black armbands, etc., and there was a big deal about our interest in executing that war, and the students decided to protest like students do. The Supreme Court ruled against the school district, saying that the school district could not restrict the rights of student speech, and they recognized to a limited extent the constitutional First Amendment right of students in their free speech administration. Okay, so this was the first case where it was recognized that students in public schools do have free right for speech according to the First Amendment. So Hazelwood School District versus Colmeyer, 1988, is another free speech. This is dealing with student expression in school newspapers and having students allowed to publish in public school newspapers, school papers, based on indecent speech. What the court stated is that school officials can intervene and discipline students for making indecent speech in either a school assembly attended by their peers in the school and in public school publications. So this was limitations to student free speech rights in this case. The Honig versus Doe, 1988, is related to students with disabilities. The issue was a violation of the Education for All Handicapped Children Act which is now IDEA, and it's related to school discipline of special education students, exceptional children. This particular school suspended a student with disabilities indefinitely, and the district attempted to expel two emotionally disturbed students without appropriate due process protections. So IDEA provides for discipline of students with disabilities. Let me make that clear. But there are very specific procedures for removing a special ed student from the academic learning environment. And the decision stated that IDEA authorizes officials to suspend dangerous children for a maximum of 10 days. And you all will see this in practice once you get into your classrooms. 10 days is the limit of suspension. Justice Brennan at the time said that Congress very much meant to strip schools of unilateral authority to exclude disturbed students. So again, we're upholding the rights of equal protection of students with disabilities here, and the limitations on how long they can be removed from the educational process. And 10 days is the maximum that a student with disabilities can be removed from the educational program on suspension. And within those 10 days, processes fall into place for looking at a student's IEP and providing alternative education assistance. So you all will get into that in more detail as you start looking at instructional practices when you get into your classroom. And then finally, New Jersey versus TLO deals with equal protection again, and it's on search and seizure of students' belongings in the school, whether it's a locker, a purse, or any of their personal belongings. The court decided that school officials have to have reasonable cause when searching students on a campus. School officials and teachers just can't go in and say, I need to look in your purse, I need to go into your locker. There has to be probable cause for that to happen. And there, again, your school districts will outline how and what this looks like. Okay? So that's just a general overview of some of the cases that deal with equity and justice in the public school. I highly recommend that if you're interested in any of these cases, go ahead and put them in Google. Take a look at the actual Supreme Court decisions. They are very interesting. I'm just going to have to say they're very interesting. So I hope this was helpful. And so let's move on to the next topic of education reform and accountability. This is a huge topic, and there's no way that we could really delve into this in 1 week's worth of content. We can, I think we'll look at this from a big picture perspective here this week, just to give you some framing, to also think about the policies and programs that you all are looking at in your inquiry research project for this course. These are some implications here that may affect how you're analyzing the programs and policies that you've chosen for your research. So let's go ahead and look at some of the trends in recent years. We're going to go back to the 2008 recession. 10 years ago, it was a pretty bad deal, and recovering from that took a toll on the public schools generally in our country. We've seen increased expectations for accountability. There's been an increase in the availability of research and program evaluations and school district evaluations and findings from that research that have influenced a number of reform efforts and accountability efforts for schools. What's come out of this is a larger focus on student diversity. And then finally, how technology trends have developed in education to look at accountability systems and reform in the public schools. So, the recession hit everybody hard. Parents of students in the public schools were hit hard. Teachers and staff in public schools were hit hard, and school administrations and district administrations and budgets and monies, everything was hit hard after what happened in 2008. So you can see these four things are pretty key implications. School budgets shrunk tremendously. So that meant hiring freezes, that meant teacher pay cut freezes that we are still trying to come out of today. This is kind of where you all will see why teacher salaries have not moved. It's because of the recession that we saw begin in 2008, and we just haven't recovered back to pre-2008 standards where teacher salaries were a little bit better than they are today. We saw a huge cut in extracurricular programming. Arts education programs were cut. After school education programs were cut. We saw class sizes increase after the recession hit. We had to work with more students with less teachers, and you all know what that means for teacher practice and education opportunity for students. The technology developments, however, which seems like counterintuitive, but I mean, we can just look at all the technology that we have. Classroom instructional technology has increased. We are seeing the increase in assessment of student learning via technology. Smart boards, for instance, are a huge thing. And then increased technology for administering school business processes. So in North Carolina, the NC School portal that parents go into to look up student grades and for teachers to do attendance in, that is one of the outcomes for technology developments in this era. And then, of course, social media. I don't think we need to go into any detail about that. I mean, that has exploded from the lowly MySpace generation up to now we're doing Instagram and Snapchats and all that. So you all can see how that is implemented. So let's look at expectations for accountability. The annual student testing is continuing. Data and reporting for individualized students, disaggregated student groups by race, ethnicity, nationality, like that NAEP, those two NAEP reports for math and reading that I showed you, disaggregated breakdowns based on race, gender, ability status, free and reduced meal status. All of that reporting trending has happened within the last couple of decades here in the United States, so we can kind of look at how to improve student performance overall. And then teacher licensing standards, school reform models, and school and teacher evaluation processes are huge and are a controversial reforms that are in the public schools today. We're not going to get into all of that, but you all are seeing the effects of teacher licensing with your Praxis Core testing, your NES testing, and your Praxis 2 subject matter testing. All of these licensing standards are being implemented nationally based on reform efforts and increased accountability for teachers and their expertise in the classroom. And then in the second column, we're looking at research and evaluation, where we are moving even further in the direction of evidence-based programming for instruction and for what we're talking about in our class here, increasing equity and inclusion in the schools and providing more socially just spaces for students. We are now in the curve that we're looking at how do we support all social groups in accessing their free and public education, and using data to inform our classroom and school efforts. And then finally, a focus on student diversity in the curriculum and how we instruct second language learners and exceptional student learners. How are we going to address performance gap? That is a never-ending process, as you can see in some of the data outcomes for the NAEP that we looked at in week 1. And then ensuring that what we're doing in our classroom meets the needs of exceptional learners and learners across ability, social categories, and other social groups. Okay, so these are big picture issues. You can think about these in terms of when you're talking to the principals and the staff that you're going to be interviewing for your research project, how some of these trends have influenced the development of the programs that you're looking at, and how these programs address issues of equity and inclusion through the lens of that framework in our Gorski and Pothini book, and that equity literacy framework. Okay, so let's look at now oppression, power, and privilege. This is where that equity literacy framework really comes into play, because that framework addresses how to dismantle systems of oppression, power, and privilege. And becoming an equity literate educator is incumbent upon you as future teachers and as pre-service teachers, as you're going through your classroom, to begin practicing those equity literate skills in order to help create oppression-free and equitable systems in your classroom specifically, and to support programming in the schools that you're going to be working in to make these environments for all students safe and supportive. Okay, so let's look at some definitions again. Maybe some of you all can, I'll ask if you all can add some of these words to the glossary for me. I didn't get a chance to put these in. If you all can go, I'm going to move the glossary down to week 3. If you all could share the work of including these definitions in our glossary, that would be great. So prejudice is, and I'm coming from our Is Everyone Really Equal textbook from this week. Prejudice is about members of social groups to which we don't belong. Okay, it is a state of mind and thought that is based on limited knowledge or experience with different social groups. It's basically holding on to stereotypes. Okay, they're simplistic judgments and assumptions that are made and projected onto everybody in that particular group. I don't think I need to give any examples here. I think the one realization that we all need to come to grips with is that we all hold stereotypes about different groups. We cannot avoid this because of how we are socialized in this society. So understanding our prejudices and being actively aware of them will help us in our anti-oppression efforts. Discrimination is the actions that we take based on our prejudices towards other social groups. And when we act on those prejudices and those prejudgments, we are discriminating. It doesn't matter whether it's racial discrimination, whether it's ability discrimination, whether it's age discrimination, whatever prejudices and stereotypes that we have, when we act on those prejudices and stereotypes, whether it's telling a joke, whether it's infringing on somebody's rights, that is a discriminatory practice. In the classroom, that might look like a teacher who is consistently kicking black male students out of their classroom, and is based on that person's prejudices. Okay, so we all have the potential for discrimination, and I would venture a guess that if we thought about what we do on a daily basis when we're walking around campus, when we're walking in cities, when we're going out to eat, when we're visiting schools, we can find unintentional instances of how we discriminate against other social groups. So implicit bias is coming, you've already stepped into some of that with the Project Implicit that we did last week. Implicit bias refers to the attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions unconsciously. Okay, so these are our prejudices that just come out naturally without us thinking about them. These are biases that are both favorable and unfavorable. They are involuntary and we have no intentional control over them. Okay, they are just a part of how we are socialized in the society. They're different from the known biases that we have, that we might conceal so we're not seeming to be prejudiced and discriminatory of others. Implicit biases are not readily seen. Okay, they're very subtle. Oppression is the systems of prejudice and discrimination by one group against another. So we have individual prejudices. We act on our prejudices individually in our own discriminatory behaviors, unintentionally in most cases. Oppression is the collective prejudicial and discriminatory behaviors that is supported by society's institutions. So in education, that would look like how discipline policies are written, how the curriculum is determined in a school district by the state. That can manifest systems of oppression in both of those ways. Okay, it occurs when one group is able to enforce its prejudice and discrimination throughout society. It is a group issue because it controls the institutions. Oppression is beyond our own individual prejudices and discriminatory practices. So it comes from different perspectives. Oppression can be historical, so we think about slavery. It could be ideological, and we can think about in the 50s and 60s of Jim Crow laws and how blacks had their own water fountains and whites had their own water fountains, and blacks they couldn't sit at the counter in certain restaurants. They had to sit in the back of the bus. That's a group level oppression. It could be institutional. In the 60s and 70s, the federal government instituted a policy on redlining, where different neighborhoods within towns were divided up into white sections and black sections. And when you hear coming from the wrong side of the tracks, that is a direct manifestation of institutional oppression and housing opportunity. People on the other side of the tracks were usually minoritized social groups. Okay, that was an intentional process to oppress minoritized groups. And then finally, We have cultural oppression, which is the unspoken and unconscious rules. If you look on page 37 in our Is Everyone Really Equal? It's a great iceberg, the illustration depicting how culture supports oppressive systems. Okay? So I just want you to remember, oppression is dealing with systems of prejudice and discrimination, not individual prejudice and discrimination. It is built into institutionally. Okay? Power is the ideological, technical, and discursive ways that those in authority think dominant groups, and let me go here, those in authority, dominant groups, this column, okay? How those dominant groups impose ideas, interests, and practices on everybody in the society. Okay, it's pretty simple. And then privilege is something that's pretty sticky with a lot of folks, but I just want to highlight that we all have privilege in one way or another. Again, I'm going to go back to the social groups table. Privilege comes from being a part of a dominant social group, okay? And I think that once we understand that all of us, regardless of where we come from, belong to at least one of these dominant groups, okay? So privilege deals with membership in a dominant group. It has nothing to do with the color of skin, and solely that we know that race does have privilege, but privilege is not the product of fortune, luck, or happenstance, or pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. It is the outcome of advantages that some social groups have and others do not. So it's made up of privileged groups and non-privileged groups, okay? So when we start thinking about privilege, I know in common and popular culture discussions, we think about privilege in terms of white privilege and black against blacks and minorities. That's just one aspect of it, okay? Dominant groups receive social and institutional advantages, okay? So being a member of one of the list of dominant groups, a person within that membership automatically receives privilege just by being a member of that group. So I want you all to think, let's look at ability. If we are non-disabled, we are privileged because everything that functions in this society is geared towards the able-bodied, okay? So the disabled have had to fight for universal design in buildings to make sure that buildings are accessible for people of different disabilities, ramps, elevators. Elevators in schools is a big one. Accessibility in classrooms. Teachers normally just go ahead and write curriculum with able-bodied students in mind, and then we have to quote-unquote accommodate special ed students. That is a privileged perspective, that we must accommodate disabled students. Our instructional practices need to come out of that privileged position to open up how we look at our planning and curriculum to incorporate all students in the process, so it becomes natural that we plan for able-bodied and disabled students without having to determine an accommodation, okay? But until we get to that point, we have to have the IDEA law to be able to articulate what needs to happen to support that non-privileged, minoritized group of disabled students. I hope that makes sense. Okay. So if you all could add these, and you can look up your own terminology, but they're good definitions in our is everyone really equal? If we could add these into our class glossary, that would be great. All right, the 5 faces of oppression. These are the ways that systems of dominance oppress minoritized groups. Okay, I took the definitions here from Readings for Diversity and Social Justice, the 3rd edition. It's edited by Adams, Blumenfeld, Castaneda, Hackman, Peters, and Zuniga in 2013. You can find it on Amazon if you're interested. Let me put this on the slide for you. Let's put it right here. Okay. And I will make this a little bit smaller. There we go. All right. So these, I want you all to, these next couple slides, I want you all to think about how you all can use these concepts and ideas in your analysis of the programs that you've chosen for your research paper. Okay, what do these look like in K-12 schools? How can school programming and policies assist with these concerns related to oppression? How can school policies and programs, the ones that you all are looking at, help in defining anti-oppressive practices through these 5 faces of oppression? This is a good foundation for looking at your interviews with the school personnel who are running the programs and policies that you've chosen. So let's go through these 5 ideas. So exploitation is oppression, again, systemic oppression. It's not individual, it is the system. So think education and for our purposes. This oppression occurs through the steady process of the transfer of labor of one social group to benefit another. Okay, so if you think about this in terms of education, if we go back to slavery, you all will recall that slaves were not given the benefit of formal education because their main purpose was to conduct the labor in the South to help the dominant group, social group, increase their income and economic advantage. So they were exploited through their labor, and they were excluded from the education process of the white children in that time period because they were used to drive the economic engine of slavery for white people's benefit. Okay, that's just one example. Marginalization is an oppression that occurs when a whole category of people is expelled from the useful participation in society. And sometimes they're subjected to material deprivation and even extermination. So, marginalized in terms of education. If we look at the history of Native Americans in this country, and the system of reservations and removing Native Americans from the land of this country that they were indigenous peoples from, and placed on reservations and provided separate schoolings. Some were taken away and assimilated into other types of schools to become indoctrinated into dominant culture, norms, and policies and procedures of education. That's how they were marginalized. Okay? The reservation process kept them from the natural course of events in American life, and we can see the results of that placement on reservations and how Native American populations have been placed on the outskirts of American society. Okay, other individuals that have marginalized can be different social groups who are looking for jobs, cannot get jobs because of the social group that they're a part of, the minoritized social group that they're part of. The disabled people are often marginalized. When they can't access a building or a place because the institution does not have the appropriate accommodation to allow them in, so they become excluded from participating fully in whatever institution that is that they're going to. Okay, so marginalization is placing people on the outskirts of society based on their social group. Powerlessness is based on class and social position. So I want y'all to think. For example, what do you hear when somebody says middle class? What do you hear and see when somebody says working class? What do you hear and see when somebody says affluent? Okay, this is a very subtle type of oppression. The powerless usually have little to no work autonomy. So as teachers, you all are more autonomous in what you can do in your classroom versus say somebody that is working at Food Line at the cash register. Okay, I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with working at Food Line in the cash register, but there's a working class, middle class, affluent class comparison that goes on here. So the person who is the CEO of Goldman Sachs on Wall Street is going to have a very different set of power versus a teacher versus a cashier at Walmart. Okay, that's what powerlessness is. It goes from affluent, more power, more autonomy, more creativity, more judgment, more authority, and then it trickles down to working class folks who have less work autonomy, have less ability to exercise their creativity and judgment in their work, and have less authority in what they do on a day-to-day basis in their work. So the class example is one example of powerlessness. We can see that across different social groups and how that manifests in the power and privilege table based on dominant groups who have the power and minoritized groups who have little power. Okay? Cultural imperialism is a form of oppression that involves the universalization of dominant groups' experiences and cultures and makes it the norm. Okay? So what's the norm of religion? What's the norm of buildings and facilities as it relates to ability? That's what cultural imperialism is. And then finally, violence is literal, systemic violence enacted upon marginalized social groups. The biggest example right now that is in our national discussion is the relationship between law enforcement and Black Americans and the violence that results between those two individuals. I'll just leave that there. So you all should be able to recognize each of these when you go into your schools and classrooms and kind of be able to identify what they look like. They might be subtle. They may be, you may find yourself in a school that has thought about this in detail and have made positive steps to eliminating these oppressive situations and scenarios. This is what I want you all to think about when you're looking at your programs. Do they actually, the programs that you've chosen, do they actually deal with these faces of oppression, and how do they deal with it? Okay? And then this is our social group table. I just put this in here so you all can have a reminder of who the dominant groups are, who the minoritized groups are, and then what that oppression looks like between the two. Okay? So the oppression comes from this column to this column. All right? All right, internalized dominance is a concept, again, that I want you all to think about how your programs and policies that you've chosen in your research topics, programs, policies you've chosen, internalized dominance and internalized oppression, how your programs that you've chosen have addressed these, if at all. And if you find that they have not addressed the faces of oppression or internalized dominance or internalized oppression, that's what you're going to write to in terms of the equity literacy framework, and you're going to have to make an analysis and recommendations on how these programs might be fashioned in a way to address some of these issues. Okay? So this internalized dominance, these are examples of how dominant social groups rationalize their position in society. Okay, this is on page 71 of our Is Everyone Really Equal? I'm not going to read through all of these, but they are rationalizations that are not based in any sort of factual basis. They are based upon how society has propped up these dominant social groups to be in their position of privilege, and how they maintain positions of privilege. So these are the things that we need to combat in order to create anti-oppressive, anti-racist opportunities in our school. Okay? And you all can see in your programs whether or not these types of thoughts and processes are being addressed in the program statements and policy statements and school vision and mission statements and school goals. How are these detrimental thoughts and actions addressed in the school? Same thing with internalized oppression, but these are the thoughts, beliefs, and actions that are internalized by minoritized groups. And again, I'm not going to go through this. Each one of these bullets, this is on page 72 of our Is Everyone Really Equal? These are the ways that minoritized groups think about themselves. And Steele does a great job in illustrating how oppression is internalized via stereotype threat across groups. That's the perfect example for our class, but it comes in a number of ways. A recent example is the Dove campaign, and I'll put this video in our week 3. Dove did a commercial here in the last, I want to say 6 months, where they talked about how their soap, their liquid soap, gets you nice and clean. And what they did was used a black female and a white female to get this point across, and you can see how it manifests both internalized dominance and internalized oppression. So I'm going to post that in our discussion question. I have a discussion question that deals with both of these conditions. So I this is also what I want you all to see in your programs. Do your programs address any of these behaviors? And how do they address these behaviors? If they do not, then you need to critically discuss ways in which the programs you've chosen could do a better job. Okay. I don't know if you all know what microaggression is. I will quickly tell you that they are everyday slights and insults that minoritized social groups endure that dominant folks don't notice or concern themselves with. So one that comes offhand is when a microaggression is when a white person asks to touch a black person's hair, okay, because they're interested in that black person's hair. That is a microaggression, asking a black person if you can touch their hair. That's just an example, okay? All right, so your weekly reflection is going to be based on these next two slides. I've already posted that in week 3. You're going to be thinking about this question. How does your internalized dominance, your own personal internalized dominance, and thinking about which group that you fall in this column, right? How your internalized dominance and oppression impacts your social relationships. And I want you to take it a step further, how that will impact what you do in the classroom, okay? The next one I want you to think about for your reflection is how does your internalized dominance and oppression, so now you're going to think about where you're at here and where you're at here, right? How both of those conditions impact your professional relationships here at App State, on campus, your peer relationships, your relationships in your communities, and how it will impact you and your students in your future classrooms. The weekly reflection is written in the As You Learn page. You can go to it and see. So that's the lecture for this week. Just a couple of housekeeping points. The research paper assignment has been uploaded into week 3. It's a little booklet that I made for you all so you can see from what the overall assignment is going to look like to each of the steps that we're going to take. Please read that this week. Check in with yourself on your annotated bibliography that is due at the end of week 4. I put that assignment also underneath the research paper link. And I'm going to upload today, by the end of the day, the assignment for your education philosophy statement. Okay? This week's lecture on internalized dominance, internalized oppression, and the 5 faces of oppression are going to be critical to defining your education philosophy. We will go through that probably in week 4. I'll talk about this in a little bit more detail on how you're going to apply these concepts to the development of your ed philosophy statement. And then check in again to make sure that your participation critical discussion posts meet the rubric requirements, both your initial post and your reply to your peers in the classroom, and then review the directions for this week's weekly reflection. It is different from last week, okay? There's no Ed Team assignment this week. We're going to have one next week. Email me if you still have not gotten your Gorski and Pathini case studies on diversity and social justice, please. And I will put a thread in there if you all want to talk about the case that we worked on, because it was dealing with the First Amendment issues, the establishment of religion in schools. So that's it. That's all, folks. Have a great rest of the week. Do good, and good will come back to you. Call me, email me, come see me. I'm in Wright College of Education, room 105. I'm here to help you all any way that I can. And I would like to see you at some point during the semester. I'm here every day, and I'm here on the weekends too. So I'm just trying to make sure that you all are successful. So again, do good. to get good, and I will talk to you all later. Bye.